want to get in and read a little bit more of this op-ed that's up at humanevents.com. I wrote it this morning, kind of a flash piece. Jack Posobiec making beasts of men. Why are two high-profile political assassins reportedly tied to the furry fetish? Crooks and Robinson both fit the profile perfectly. Socially isolated, downwardly mobile, young white men from working class or middle class suburbs radicalized in the exact online spaces where economic resentment, racial grievance, and sexual deviancy all converge. And these are two names that should haunt every parent, policymaker, and patriot right now. Thomas Matthew, and guys, let's show the photos of them both. Thomas Matthew Crooks, the 20-year-old who climbed onto a rooftop in Butler, Pennsylvania on July 13th, 2024, and fired the shot that came within inches of killing President Donald Trump. Then Tyler Robinson, the 22-year-old who walked into an event at Utah Valley University and allegedly executed conservative activist Charlie Kirk in cold blood. When I went to the White House and talked about left-wing violence, I talked about the profile of these individuals. I told the President of the United States himself that there is a profile, there is a pattern, we need to understand it. And I want to throw some facts out here. The crisis is not just young men. It's specifically young white men who have experienced the sharpest, most psychologically disorienting fall from grace in modern American history. And that precipitous drop is the single biggest driver of the online perversion to political violence pipeline we're watching in real time. Go back to 1970. A white man with only a high school diploma had a 75 to 80% chance of earning more, inflation adjusted, than his father. By 2020, that number had collapsed to 50%. The worst intergenerational decline of any demographic group in the entire country. White men without college degrees saw their real wages fall 15% from 1979 to 2022, while every other major racial, gender group held either steady or gained. The labor force participation rate for prime-age white men, 25 to 54, has cratered from 97% in 1960 to 88% today, the lowest of any racial group. Suicide rates, opioid deaths, deaths of despair are overwhelmingly concentrated among white working-class males, and those are the same males that face same white males who face alienation from every elite university, institution, corporate HR, university admissions, government contracting, policies that discriminate against them, affirmative action, DEI hires, quote unquote, diversity hires, and the endless media drumbeat that white men are the problem and tell them in 1,000 ways that the system no longer has a place for them unless they apologize for existing. And you wonder why then they disassociate with reality, they disassociate from a system that hates them, and they find more and more association with radicalization, radical sexual behaviors online. We saw this before in a place 100 years ago called the Weimar Republic in Weimar, Germany. Well, Joshua, we're working through some of these profiles. Obviously, you and I wrote the very first book on Thomas Matthew Crooks, Bulletproof, the plot to kill President Trump, and the untold stories of this. We now have new information. I certainly expect we've got perhaps a second edition in store here. What do you make, before we get into my analysis, what do you make of the new information that links Thomas Matthew Crooks with gender ideology, with perhaps the furry fetish as well?
Well, with this furry business, it's not surprising because making men of beasts, that's dehumanizing. That's, to use another verb, unhumaning of an individual, taking the soul of a human being and equating it to the sexual activity of literally animals, a sort of quasi-bestiality type of shenanigans over there. I don't think we could have picked a better title for this sort of far left-wing aligned ideology and behavior, because when you state that there's nothing special about human beings, the soul, which is part and parcel with left-wing ideology, far left-wing tends to be extraordinarily atheistic, and its rejection of all things metaphysical, spiritual, and makes an all-powerful government effectively a stand-in for God. The philosophical downstream of that practically is we're not special, we're just animals, so we should just act like it. And this is a warped, bizarre sort of turbo-maxed version of that far left-wing ideology that unhumans an individual with the furry and the gender sort of thing. Because if there's nothing, let's say, transcendent about the male and the female, and male and female, he created them. If you completely reject that ideology or that sort of origin story of humanity, then you can just be whatever you want. And I have observed this in individuals in my own life, and this is where that racial resentment gets into the picture. Jack, I have seen kids go from being, straight white male to begin to fall in with the gender crowd, let's say the gender bending crowd, transvestites, and with the self-hating language about how awful white people are, and white people are so oppressive, and we're like worse than animals. I have heard that expression used to refer to specifically young white men, like animals or worse than animals, that sort of unhumaning animalization of them. It's the opposite of anthropomorphizing, actually, which is a word where you kind of describe animals like people in a certain way. It's doing the opposite. Unhuman works as the verb here. And they go from being straight white males to being openly bisexual or to being homosexual. And then you start seeing makeup, and you start seeing nails, you start seeing other accessories. And I've seen individuals go from being straight white males with not a whole lot of economic prospects, spending all of their time on Reddit or these other websites and disassociating from friends and family, being 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, still living in mom and dad's house, not having a whole lot of career prospects, and then one day announcing that you're going dress shopping and you go by she, her pronouns or by they, them pronouns. And I have seen this directly start with left-wing, anti-white, anti-male rhetoric that they got from the public school system.
And so when we look at all this together, right, and when you and I wrote the book on humans, we talked about it because we saw there was this disassociation with humanity. And in fact, what we urged was for people to try to rebuild as best they could that connection with humanity. But what I've said, what we said in the book, and I went on Fox and Friends this weekend and said it as well, that all of this is downstream of economic conditions. It is economic conditions that drive this. Now, whether that be inflation, whether it be mass immigration, it's all of it. It's all of it put together. So you create this cesspool, then you add in the transgenderism, then you add in the anti-white hatred, and it creates this toxic soup whereby in these young white men in these areas, particularly, and in these cases, both gifted young white men, then turn to extreme behaviors and then eventually extreme actions because they feel that there is no hope for them in the rest of society, in the rest of the system.
Yes, and it's an explicitly anti-Christian religion when you describe it that way, where it's like wearing the Christian skin suit, let's say, or that shell or that template, where you have original sin of being a straight white male. Each of those are 3 intersectional points against you. You're way on down the priority list at this point. You have grievous sins in your nature, and so the only way to redeem yourself is to undo each of those as much as you can. So you have to become not straight. You have to engage in other kinds of behaviors, and if it's not quite possible to not be a white male, or at least white, well, then what can you do? Okay, well, you can become a different whole species.